the non-dual invocation to the divine. This is a name I gave to this verse, which is found in the Shiva Manasa Puja, the mental worship of Shiva, a short text in which this verse occurs as the fourth verse. I'll sing it and then we can do the word by word breakdown. Atma twam girijamati sahachara prana sharirangraham pujate vishayopabogarachana nidra samadhi stiti sanchara padayo pradakshina vidhi stotrani sarvagira Yadyat karma karomi tattadakilam shambho tavaradhanam. So this verse is in a meter, a Sanskrit meter called Shardula Vikridita, which means tiger's play. Tiger's play meter goes da da dit 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 da dit da dit 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 da 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 dit dit da da da, right? So you hear that rhythm in every verse written in Tiger's Play meter. So if I speak it instead of sing it, the rhythm is more clear. Atma tvam girijamati sahachara prana shariram graham puja te vishayopaboga rachana nidra samadhi stiti Sanchara padayo pradakshina vidhi stotrani sarvagira yadyat karma karomi tattadakilam shambho tavaradhanam. So you can begin to understand perhaps what an enormous poetic challenge it is for an author to write in a strict meter like that. That has to be the rhythm. The words have to fit into that rhythm. So it's much more challenging than English poetry, where you're just rhyming end lines, for example. Sort of like Shakespeare had to fit everything he said, well, he chose, I suppose, to fit everything he said into iambic pentameter. And that's a challenge, but not quite as great of a challenge because this meter is much more specific, detailed, and disallowing of variance. So it's a really beautiful thing when an author can write well in this particular meter and other meters like it. Okay, so the rhythm, the meter, is not changeable. The melody is changeable. So you can sing in different possible melodies as long as the pronunciation and the meter remain the same. So let's break it down word by word, or rather phrase by phrase. So the first phrase is Atma Tvam. You are my very self. Right? Myself is you. You are myself. Atma Tvam. Now, context is everything. The context is that this verse occurs in a text which is mental worship of Shiva, performing worship of the deity mentally instead of physically, okay? So this is a verse of praise of Lord Shiva, of God, if you like, but it's giving a powerful non-dual teaching. And the way in which this teaching is structured is that all the kind of traditional terminology of adoration of a deity are here recast as elements of one's own embodied experience. So, for example, in the traditional iconography of a deity, you've got the central deity, and the deity has a consort or a partner, and then has sort of servants or attendants, and these are again recast. Here, the deity is said to be one's own innermost self. So the the text is addressing Shiva, as it were, and saying, "You are my very self." So the self is cast here as the deity, and so the consort, Shiva's consort, is here understood as the mind. So the self is the deity, and the consort of the deity is one's own mind. So we get the phrase next, Girija Matihi. Now, Girija literally means woman born of the mountain, or mountain girl, and that is a name for Parvati, the consort of Shiva, right? But again, here we have this transposition. This is Shiva is now identified as the innermost self of you and of all beings. The consort, Shiva's consort, Parvati, is identified with the mind. Now, how does this make logical sense? Well, because the mind is Shakti, right? So the goddess, Shiva's consort, is Shakti, is energy, and the mind is energy. So the mind is Shakti, and the mind is also the consort, as it were, of the innermost self. There's a kind of divine dance, or can be a divine dance, between essence, nature, and the mind. Okay, so in other contexts, the mind is identified with the moon, which waxes and wanes in its ability to reflect the light of the sun. So in the same way, the mind waxes and wanes in its ability to reflect the light of the innermost self. Okay, but having said that, let's be clear that if this verse occurred in the context of mental worship of Shakti, then these roles would be reversed. So this is not, see, in the Indian tradition, whatever deity you're worshiping in that moment is the supreme deity, okay? So this is something that's hard for Westerners to sort of wrap their head around. So here it looks like Shiva is being centered, right, as the ultimate, the absolute, and indeed he is. But in other contexts, it's Shakti, it's the goddess, who is named as the absolute, and then it's Shiva, who is her subordinate consort. So we have abundant examples of this. We don't need to look hard at all. So it's like they take turns in a way. If we want to be a little bit playful about it, we could say they take turns being on top. So this is here, Shakti is the consort, but in other context, Shiva is the consort, right? Okay, so far we have Atma Tvam, you are my very self. O Lord, you are my very self. Girija Matihi, Parvati is my mind. Shakti is my mind. Your consort is my mind. And then we get the phrase, Sahacharaha Pranaha. My 5 pranas, my 5 pranavayus are your 5 attendants. So again, this sort of almost courtly image of the visualization of the deity being surrounded by attendants. You know, one is fanning the deity with a fly whisk, and others holding a parasol and things like that. So here the attendants of this deity that is the innermost self are understood to be the 5 pranavayus, that is to say prana, apana, samana, udana, and vyana. So if you're not familiar with those, well, you can learn about them. I can't explain them now. But the 5 pranavayus we could perhaps summarize as exhale, inhale, the energy which moves food through the digestive tract, the uprising energy which makes possible speech and belching and vomiting, and the all-pervasive life force energy that allows us to flex and move our limbs. These are the sort of basic functions. There's also yogic functions to these 5 pranavayus. And these 5 pranavayus are the attendants of the deity here in this non-dual recasting of traditional iconography. Okay, so then where is all this taking place? It's of course taking place in the house of the deity, that is to say the temple, And here, the temple is the body of the tantric practitioner, right? So we get the phrase, shariram garham, my body is the temple. So we hear this phrase a lot in modern postural yoga. The body is a temple, the temple of God, the temple of the divine. But we don't find this teaching anywhere in pre-tantric yoga. We don't find this teaching in Patanjali, right? In fact, it's a totally tantric teaching, and a lot of people don't know that. The body is the temple of God. So this is one of several places where we find that teaching in tantric sources. Okay, so shariram garham. But when you're singing, that final M of shariram turns into more like an N to fit with the following G. Sharirang garham. Can you see and hear the difference? If you just even watch my lips. The spoken, you say shariram garham. Singing, you say sharirang garham. So it's a nasal that fits with the following consonant. So in singing Sanskrit, you use the homorganic nasal, meaning you use the nasal that fits with the following consonant. Okay. So, O Lord, you are my very self. Your consort, the goddess, is my mind. My 5 pranas are your attendants. My body is your temple. Atma tvam girijamati sahachara prana shariram garham. And again, singing, those M's are going to become Ngs before G's when singing, so listen. Atma tvam girijamati sahachara prana shariram garham. So in terms of that hum organic nasal, it's a subtle difference, but not too hard to pick up, because in fact you're making the nasal sound which most easily fits with the following consonant. That's what hum organic nasal means. So one more time. Atma tvam girijamati sahachara prana shariram garham. That's the first quarter of the verse. Now we go to the second quarter of the verse, the second pada. Pujate vishayopabhoga rachana nidra samadhi stitihi. Okay. So the first, this is two statements are here. Puja te, your worship, meaning worship of you. Worship of you is, in this non-dual context, vishayopabhoga rachana. The activity of enjoying sense objects, literally. Vishaya upabhoga rachana. Okay, the activity of enjoying sense objects is worship of you, meaning to say, when I give my eyes beautiful things to see, when I give my ears beautiful things to hear, when I give my mouth beautiful, delicious things to taste, when I give my nose beautiful things to smell, when I give my hands beautiful things to touch, that is worship of this innate divinity who is consciousness, right? So in this non-dual context, worship of the deity is enjoying the objects of the senses. Well, you can't really get much more tantric than that, right? You will not find any such teaching in the Yoga Sutra or any pre-tantric source, right? So that you actually do a spiritual practice here, which is taught in the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, and we're coming up on it in the next few weeks, of feeding the goddesses of the senses, as it were. It's one way it's metaphorically described, or worshiping the innate divinity that is consciousness with the objects of beauty, of aesthetic pleasure that converge in the heart, meaning that converge and melt and merge into consciousness most easily. So contemplate that. You actually have a spiritual duty. If you're walking the tantric path, you have a spiritual duty to worship the innate divinity with beautiful sights, sounds, smells, tactile experiences and tastes. Okay, and also there's a sixth sense, which is in the Indian tradition, thought. So you must give your mind beautiful things to think about, i.e., ponder the spiritual teachings, right? And this is actually something close to a kind of spiritual duty for a tantrika. It's said that if you do not feed the goddesses of the senses, they become starved and they devour your capacity for joy. That is to say, you lose your capacity for joy increasingly if you don't nourish the goddesses of the senses, and you increase your capacity for joy if you do nourish them. Okay, and so that's another traditional kind of tantric image of these goddesses of the senses as part of the mandala, at the center of which is consciousness. Okay, so then nidra samadhi stitihi. So when I sleep, that is, O Lord, your state of samadhi, right? This innate divinity that you are, that is Shiva, is experiencing samadhi every time you go to sleep, right? So this is not to say that therefore you don't need to meditate. It's just to say that actually there's this natural repose within consciousness, a natural samadhi that can take place every time we sleep. So the whole line then, the whole pada goes, Puja te vishayo pabhoga rachana nidra samadhi stitihi. Okay. Puja te vishayo pabhoga rachana nidra samadhi stitihi. Okay, so third pada, third line, or verse quarter. Sanchara padayo pradakshina vidhi stotrani sarva giraha. So the the activity, the motion, literally the motion of my 2 feet. It's a little clunky sounding when you put it in English, but perfectly fine in Sanskrit. The sanchara of my padas, of my two feet, padayoho, is the sacred rite of pradakshina. So pradakshina is when in India, well, anywhere really, but it started in India, when you walk clockwise around a sacred site or a deity, you enact with the body your belief or feeling that your life revolves around the divine. So just walking in a clockwise pattern around the temple or deity or stupa, that's pradakshina. Okay, so it's a sacred act, though. It's a vidhi. It's a sacred rite. So here in this non-dual mode, wherever I walk, I am walking around you, O Lord. I am doing your pradakshina. I can't stop doing your pradakshina, for you are everywhere. You are the one consciousness that manifests as all the objects of my experience, and I'm constantly worshiping you by walking around. Beautiful, right? Okay. I need to plug in before the battery dies so we can finish this amazing verse. Okay, so then we have the phrase stotrani sarva giraha. All my words, all my speech, sarva giraha, are stotras, are hymns in praise of this one divinity who is consciousness. Right? My words cannot be anything but praises of different aspects of this one infinite divine consciousness. Why? Because actually, even if I'm, hating on something, even if I'm speaking about my dislike for something, that's still that is still the mind eulogizing an aspect of conscious experience, if you will. So I realize that might seem strange, right? But from a non-dual point of view, whatever you're talking about is the mind, which is a contracted form of consciousness, exploring an aspect of its own experience. Even if you're talking about, oh, I really don't like this, or I really don't like that person, right? It's actually, from a non-dual point of view, a celebration of the experience of dislike. Ponder that one. That whatever you're talking about, it's nothing but a contracted form of consciousness, the verbal mind, exploring an aspect of conscious experience. And since all consciousness wants to do is explore and celebrate itself, then that's what it is. It might be in a contracted mode, right? So contemplate this for yourself, how anything you're talking about is actually an exploration / celebration of an aspect of conscious experience, even if you can't feel it that way at the time. So, stotrani sarva giraha. Now, some of you, if you have a Siddha Yoga background, you've learned this verse with the pronunciation stotrani sarva giro. But that is a sandhi change that is only permissible if there's no breath between that word and the following line. So that is to say, that sandhi change of giraha to giro is only permissible if you don't take a breath at this point. So if you're going to go sanchara padayo pradakshina vidhi stotrani sarva giro yadyat karma karomi tatadakilam shambhota varadhanam, then you say giro, because that's the way sandhi rules work. And if you're taking a breath, you say giraha, and then take the breath. And for most people, they can't do it without a breath there, so I teach giraha. And this is a simple kind of thing known to all Sanskritists, but not to others. Okay, so sanchara padayo pradakshina vidhi stotrani sarva gira. So there's that little echoing of the vowel at the end of a line when you have a visarga, an H with a dot. Don't worry about that, just follow along. So then the fourth verse quarter goes yadyat karma karomi tatadakilam shambhotavaradhanam. Okay, so yadyat karma karomi, whatever actions I perform. Okay, yadyat karma, whatever actions karomi I perform. Okay, tatad akilam, all of those actions are tavaradhanam, worship of you. So again, from this radically non-dual mode, any actions I perform are in fact worship of the one. So that's not to say that all actions are beneficial to other beings. It's not saying that, right? It's not saying all actions are good. All actions are the one exploring itself, worshiping itself. Sometimes it worships itself in modes which are actually what we would call non-beneficial or unhealthy, right? But from a radically non-dual point of view, there's nothing ever going on but the one consciousness exploring and celebrating itself. And sometimes it explores and celebrates itself in perverse ways, right? And we don't, if you're on a path of awakening, then it matters what you do, because some actions contribute to your awakening and liberation and others don't, right? Even though everything is equally God, not everything contributes equally to the realization that everything is God. And if that seems like a paradox to you, just keep pondering it and you'll see how it's not really a paradox. It actually makes perfect sense. Just because everything is God, that doesn't mean that every action or every experience contributes to the realization that everything is God. Okay? And by the same token, if you're on a tantric path whereby you seek to benefit other beings, right? Because there's non-tantric forms of yoga that are purely for the self, like Patanjali's yoga is purely for the self. It's not concerned with benefiting other beings, right? Except incidentally, right? You don't attain liberation to help liberate other beings in pre-tantric yoga. In tantric yoga, you seek to attain liberation specifically in order to benefit all beings, including yourself, right? There's no distinction there. So in that context, then, it matters what you do. Some actions are beneficial and some are non-beneficial. So some actions, even though it's still, from the ultimate point of view, the one expressing itself, exploring itself, still those actions we call non-beneficial when they prevent others from realizing their essence nature. Okay, it can't prevent others. That's not exactly the right way to say it. If our actions inhibit or impede others' realization of their true nature by adding to their burden of pain that they need to digest, then that's non-beneficial, okay? So that's the accurate way to say it. Our actions can indeed impede, they can't prevent, but they can impede others' realization of their true nature. And that's non-beneficial. It's the opposite of what we want to be doing on this path, right? Because this is a path of love. It's not an emotionless version of yoga, of which there are many. Okay, so then we have a vocative. Shambho is inserted in the middle of the phrase. Shambho means, oh Shambhu, and Shambhu is a name of Shiva, the benevolent one. Oh benevolent Lord, in other words. Shambho literally means, oh benevolent Lord. But remember, the benevolent Lord that's being addressed here, it's already been established, is your very own self. Right at the beginning of the verse. Atma Tvam, that's the context. Oh Lord, you are my very self. I am you. You are me. Right? The divinity being praised is my innermost nature. Therefore, when I say, oh, benevolent Lord, that's actually this praise of my own innate nature, right? As in this beautiful image of Shiva pouring sacred water over his own head, doing abhishekam of himself. So, tat-tad akilam, Shambho, tava, all those actions are worship of you, O benevolent Lord. Okay, so the whole line goes, Yadyat karma karomi, tat-tad akilam, Shambho tavaram. So, Yadyat karma karomi tat-tadakilam Shambho tavaradhanam. And if you want to be super rigorously Sanskritically accurate, then the anuswara in akilam at the end of the word akilam is realized as a pure nasal before the following sibilant, sha in Shambho. So then we get Yadyat karma karomi tat-tadakilam Shambho tavaradhanam. So if you could hear that, it's not an M, it's actually an on, like in French or Portuguese. So one more time, I'll speak it first. Tat-tadakilam Shambho. Okay. Yadyat karma karomi tat-tadakilam Shambho tavaradhanam. Okay, so that's if you want maximum geek points for really pukka Sanskrit pronunciation, really totally rigorously correct according to the ancient texts on correct pronunciation of Sanskrit. Okay, so this is the non-dual invocation to the divine, Shiva Manasa Puja, verse 4. And let's sing it together, if you have it handy. If not, just listen. Atma Tvang Girijamati Sahachara Prana Sharirangraham Pujate Vishayopabogarachana Nidra Samadhi Sthiti Sancharapadeyo pradakshinavidhi stotrani sarva gira. Yadyat karma karomi tattadakilam shambho tavaradhanam. Jaya Jaya Karunabde Shri Mahadeva Shambho. Jaya Jaya Karunabde Shri Mahadeva Shambho. Hail, hail, O ocean of compassion, O great divinity, O benevolent one. Har Har Mahadev. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time. Om.